That's the issue. That's the fundamental issue. Does God save you in spite of you or because of you? That's the question. And the monergist says, wow, if it's up to me, I'm toast. I believe in a God that actually saves. His grace is powerful. And that everything that I do is the result of his grace. Everything I do is the result of his sovereign election and choice. And of course, it also...
Okay, so the opposite also must be true. And this is where the catch-22 comes within Calvinism, which they're not willing to address the other side of that statement. Because whenever you say everything that I do is as a result of God's grace, and that means everything you don't do is a result of God refraining to give you the grace necessary to do it. In other words, hard determinism. It's all it is. So when you, or any Calvinist for that matter, or any person for that matter, fails to evangelize, for example, if a Calvinist becomes hyper and becomes anti-Calvinistic, ultimate reason, if consistently held within that Calvinistic worldview, that's systematic, then it's ultimately because for some reason God withheld the needed grace for that particular Calvinist to be evangelistic. Because everything that Calvinist does, every action, every choice that they make is ultimately the result of God's gracious action, what God has graced that person to do. And it sounds like it's a higher road because what you're ultimately doing, you're saying, oh, well, God gets all the credit for all those good things I do. So if I go evangelize somebody, it's because God effectually graced me and gave me the desire to go evangelize that person, so I can't take any credit for it. So it sounds like at first reading or first hearing possibly that God is getting all the glory in this deterministic worldview of Calvinism because he's the one who's determining my desire to go and to witness to that lost person. The problem is when you look at the flip side of that exact same coin, the logical reverse of that is that when I neglect to go witness to that lost person, it's because God, for whatever reason, neglected to give me the sufficient grace to choose to do so. And so ultimately you've got God responsible for whether, yes, I go and witness, or whether I stay inactive as a hyper-Calvinist. God is ultimately the one responsible for every single choice and action, both good and evil, which flies in the face of passages like we see in James chapter 1, where it says that God does not even tempt men to do evil. Yet the Calvinists would have us believe that God is ultimately the one who decides every single evil choice that I make by refraining to give me the grace to make the choice otherwise. And again, you can debate that. You can say, well, that's the way God has chosen to manipulate his world, to control his world, to sovereignly rule his world. You can make the arguments for that. But to hit the actual point of contention, you've got to look at the full-orbed view of both the synergist, or traditionalist is the name I would prefer because I don't like the term synergism for reasons that we've already talked about, and then look and compare that to the implications of what ultimately theistic determinism and Calvinism leads to. And then weigh those two options out back and forth. And so just like you have people who reject Christ because ultimately God first rejected them, they hate God because ultimately, salvifically speaking at least, in the Calvinistic worldview, God hated them. God rejected them before the foundation of the world. Therefore, they rejected God from birth, and they could not have done otherwise. And so you ultimately had the responsibility back on God for not granting the faith, not giving sufficient means of revelation, and all those kinds of things, giving all unbelievers ultimately the perfect excuse for their unbelief. Whereas our worldview says that God has sufficiently provided the means by which all may be saved. In the same way, he's provided the means by which all Calvinists, or non-Calvinists for that matter, can understand and correctly follow right doctrine. And so therefore, if I follow wrong doctrine, or if Dr. White follows wrong doctrine, he does so by his own choosing, not by God's sovereign will, or God's sovereign meticulous deterministic means. Because otherwise you've got a really hard situation to try to explain why, within the Calvinistic worldview, Arminians even exist. Why does Dr. Brown refuse Calvinism? And it's ultimately, your answer, Dr. White, has to ultimately be that Dr. Brown and Leighton Flowers and all these other quote-unquote synergists that you're bemoaning are ultimately synergists because God has decreed for us to be that way. And again, you may say that's flattening it out and all those kinds of things, but you've yet to provide any cogent answer, coherent answer to that question. You have yet to provide any kind of a real defense as to the the reason why within the worldview of a heart that's been made new. I'm a regenerate man. Dr. Brown is a regenerate man by your own estimation. Okay, so are you a favorite child that God has graced you with the ability to understand Calvinism and has withheld that from Dr. Brown? Okay, explain that. Unless you affirm libertarian freedom, there is no way for you to explain with a coherent, logical explanation how and why one regenerate man comes to understand truth better than another regenerate man, with the exception of just saying, well, that's just the way that God's determined it. That's just the way God's done it. And then you've got the situation where you've got to admit, well, God shows favorites. God has favorites. He reveals more truth to Dr. White than other. Matter of fact, it's probably pretty true to say that we all believe that our systems and our belief system, our systematic, is the most correct one. Otherwise, we would change our views. So you believe, Dr. White, that your views are probably the most consistent. Otherwise, you wouldn't hold to them. Therefore, you must believe you're the most favorite of his children because he has supernaturally graced you with the ability to adopt all the right ologies within Christianity. Congratulations. How is that not producing pride? How is that not producing pride to say, no, it's not the fact that I make choices within the Christianity, libertarianly free choices that God has graced and sufficiently given Dr. Brown and Dr. White equal ability and an ability to make choices and to understand doctrinal truth, and therefore they're completely accountable and responsible for those choices to accept or deny certain ologies within Christianity. You don't have a coherent way of explaining that without libertarian freedom, without the concept of the ability to do otherwise, even within our worldview. Now, what you'll hear is continually Dr. White will go back to these same basic straw man arguments, false dichotomies, again, trying to paint one group into as bad of a light as possible, and painting his view as in positive a light as possible, which, again, I can understand that within a debate you want to try to paint your view in the positive light. I mean it's a given. But the principle of charity and what we learn is to try to represent the view in such a way of your opponent that they would actually say, yeah, that's what we believe. And there's no Calvinist in the world who would ever, non-Calvinist or traditionalist in the world, who would ever describe or explain salvation in the way Dr. White explains our view of salvation. And I think that's unfortunate.